Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. You will listen to an interview with Rufo Quintavalle, who shared his story, how he got into impact investing, and from there into regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. Plus, he shares his theory of change. Enjoy! Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the Planet Mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! Welcome to Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the Planet Mattered. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host. Today I'm talking to Rufo Quintavalle. Rufo is a writer, entrepreneur and impact investor. He's the author of 8 books of poetry and has more than a decade of experience in investing in renewable energy, farmland and forestry. Welcome, Rufo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So just to have a bit of a background story on your story and how did you end up in forestry and farmland? Could you share a bit, why are you doing what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, with pleasure. I have family money, which comes from my grandfather, who made his money in the car industry, essentially. When I came into that inheritance, to begin with, it was not particularly something that interested me, money. But about 10 years ago, and I think it's probably to do with having children of my own, actually. I started getting a sense that this money was something that actually did matter, that I was taking care of it on behalf of somebody else, and that if I wanted to be serious about how it was invested for my children, but also for my own peace of mind, I needed to find some kind of coherence between my values as a person and the fact that, the pure chance, the pure good chance that I happen to have money. It's a luxury that very few people have. So about 10 years ago, I started looking for ways to invest environmentally, which initially meant renewable energy. And after doing that for a few years, I sort of stopped and said, well, what do I really want to be doing? If I'm going to be serious about this, how do I become a more strategic and a more coherent and a more serious investor? And the process I went through was to not think about money at all and just to think about what mattered to me as a person. And this may sound slightly silly, but I like food. So I just sort of thought, well, look, I like food. Where does food come from? Food comes from farming. Why not see if there's a way to invest into food and farming? And this happened to be round about the time when a lot of people were getting panicked by what was going on in conventional financial markets after the sort of meltdown in 2008. So there was interest in investing into farmland at the time as an uncorrelated real asset, a sort of safe place to store your money and to conserve your wealth. So farmland was kind of there in the air. There was a sort of a buzz around it, not necessarily coming from green or environmental investors, but coming from the sort of more conventional finance space. I wanted to do it in an environmentally respectful way, so to invest into organic farmland. So that's how farming came about, partly just from that process of personal reflection, partly for financial reasons, and partly as a way to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and get it in the ground, which is a vital part of the climate equation. And forestry, a few years after that, seemed like a natural next step for me. And there's a lot of overlap between the two as well.
And in terms of, do you still remember finding your first investment and how that was like to put money into something, to put money to work according to your values? Of course, renewable energy was also your values, but less of a personal connection to it. How was that first investment?
I mean, the first investing into renewable energy, I just kind of, to be honest, I just sort of rushed into one of the first things that came my way. I was a little bit too hasty. I wanted to go out there and do good in the world. And in retrospect, I was too hasty. But at the same time, I think sometimes one can spend too long waiting as well, and you wait and wait and wait for the perfect investment. So it's quite good sometimes to get your feet in the water. Don't put in more than you can afford to lose, but sometimes it's good to make that first jump. In investing into farmland, I was more, I learned from that first experience and went a little bit more slowly and did a bit more research. But it felt good. It felt like the right thing to be doing. So if there's anyone out there listening to this who's contemplating making that leap, don't be too hasty, but don't be too slow either. Set aside a bit of money you can afford to potentially lose, and put it to work. And I always feel that think about how you would feel if you do lose that money. And to me, that's almost the definition of what an impact investment is, because it will mean different things to different people. But if you lose the money and you feel, I'm okay with that, I tried to do something worthwhile and it failed. To me, that's almost the definition of an impact investment. And if you lose the money and you're angry and bitter, then it probably wasn't an impact investment to begin with.
And what was that first one in farmland or in forestry? Is it something you want to share? And is it something you're still happy about?
Yeah. I mean, I ended up making two related investments. One which was into an asset management firm called Agroecological Investment Management that's based in New Zealand, which is where my mother is from. So there was a kind of personal connection there. But that's a company that buys conventional farmland and converts it into organic management. So I made an investment into the asset manager itself, and I also subsequently acquired a farm in New Zealand myself. So it was two related investments.
And since then, how many years ago was that?
That's a good question.
More or less, obviously, not to the day.
Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, something like that.
And how has the journey been since then? From like 6-7 years ago to now, we're talking December 2017.
I think there's more. I mean, I've since started investing into forestry and agroforestry in Brazil. So very different geography. Going from one of the most safe and stable and least corrupt countries in the world into a country that is almost the opposite. So the journey, but that's good. You go slowly and you get experience and go as fast as you're comfortable going. But no, the journey's been good and I've learned a great deal. And I mean, that's something I would say as well to anyone who's interested in doing this. Go out and educate yourself and attend conferences and speak to people and learn from their expertise. Don't waste people's time. Don't sort of set up endless calls if you've got absolutely no intention of investing. But be courteous and learn from people's expertise. And it's been a really nice experience because there's people are happy to share and people are happy to talk, and you can learn a great deal that way. So no, the experience has been good. I think there's more appetite. As I say, there was a certain kind of interest in investing into real assets starting post 2008. I think there's maybe more interest now coming from the environmental community who realized the importance of sequestering atmospheric carbon. It's not just about reducing our emissions. So that's nice to see as well. There's a bit more action, now.
And in terms of Brazil, can you explain a bit more about that project, those investments or that investment, and how you went from transitional funds to from conventional to organic to agroforestry to perennial systems, basically?
Yeah. I mean, to begin with, I thought, well, I've ticked my my agriculture box. How am I going to tick my forestry box? So like I said, I went to conferences, I read up, I met people, and tried to educate myself. So I wasn't necessarily looking to get into agroforestry to begin with, but it kind of ended up that way. I have two projects in Brazil. One which is in southern Brazil near Sao Paulo, which is a mixed use property. So it's partly native rainforest and partly commercial timber. So the idea there is to generate enough money via commercial activities, so a mix of timber harvesting and agricultural activities, and to use that money to permanently preserve the area of native rainforest, which I think ultimately will have more value. We don't really know and this is the Atlantic rainforest. It's in the south of Brazil, which unfortunately has been almost entirely destroyed. There's only 7% of the original forest cover left. But we don't know what's in the rainforest. So one of the first things that we're doing on that particular project is to start cataloging the plants that are there in this parcel of rainforest, so using it as a kind of laboratory to figure out what we've got, and then the next step to say, well, can any of this be of use, whether it's as a food or medicine or cosmetics or even for industrial use. So that's the goal there, is first to get enough money coming in to preserve this area of native rainforest. Second, to start getting a sense of what's there in the rainforest. And third, to see if any of those native crops can be planted and can be cultivated commercially. Well, then you have an incentive, not just for us, but for other people to go out and get into reforestation. Everyone wants to plant trees, everyone wants to save the rainforest, but ultimately there needs to be some kind of commercial driver if people are going to start doing this on a large scale. So that's the thinking behind that project down south. And then recently, with some friends of mine, with a group of other investors, we acquired some land way up north in a state called Amapá, which is on the eastern edge of the Amazon. And this is degraded land, so it's land that was originally a mix of rainforest and savanna, but which has unfortunately been cleared and quite severely burnt. So the dynamic there is a bit different. It's to start replanting and to plant a mix of trees, some of which are sort of quite fast-growing fruit trees. We'll have a first partial harvest after 2 or 3 years. Some are slightly slower growing fruit trees, which will come to maturity around about 5 or 6 years. And some of it will be very slow maturing timber, so to have different revenue streams. And again, my broader sort of ambition there, if this works, is to say, look, there are viable models for reforestation. It's possible to plant trees and to make money. And one of the advantages about Brazil is that things do grow very quickly there. So you can have a return on investment relatively quickly. You don't need to lock up your money for 10 or 20 years, which can be off-putting to many investors.
Yeah, which makes it very interesting. But and again, I think the Atlantic rainforest also has an enormous value, but probably not yet in dollar amounts or euro amounts, to play with the agricultural land in the rest of Latin America. They are sort of the water pump for the rest of the space there, right?
The Amazon rainforest works as a water pump. The Atlantic rainforest, unfortunately, there's so little left that it doesn't really do much.
So the water pump is really
it's the Amazon
demolished and isn't there anymore. There. Okay, yeah.
Down south. This is the southern part of Brazil is the part that has seen the most industrialization. It's where all the big cities are, and it's where a lot of the agriculture has been. Historically was installed. So unfortunately the Atlantic rainforest, it's 7% of the original cover is not a lot, So to me the challenge there would be, well, how does one sort of join up the little pockets that are left? How do you create ecological corridors to try and join up this very fragmented landscape? The Amazon, which is much better conserved, does serve this function as a water pump for the whole of Latin America. So that water evaporates from the Amazon, it heads westward. Those clouds hit the Andes and then turn south. They go south and they rain onto southern Brazil and Uruguay and parts of Argentina. So the rainfall patterns in that part of Latin America are totally dependent on what's known as the flying rivers that are generated by the Amazon rainforest. And there's actually more water in those flying rivers than there is in the Amazon River itself. And it's 200 million people living in Brazil. You add in big places like Buenos Aires and Montevideo. The consequences of disrupting those patterns of rainfall are extremely serious. So there's an intrinsic value in terms of biodiversity in the Amazon rainforest. There's also a very practical human cost. If we don't reverse the process of deforestation and start replanting trees, there's a risk that the Amazon will tip from its current state as a forest and will tip into a new equilibrium as savanna or grassland, which would have catastrophic consequences for large parts of Latin America.
Yeah, that's why you're piloting these ways of reforestation in severely degraded land.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to sort of try and prove that it can be done, and to encourage other people to do likewise. There's a need to preserve what is left of these big forest basins, whether it's the Amazon, whether it's in the Congo, or whether it's in Indonesia. We need to preserve as much as we can. There's a need to be replanting as well. And realistically, that replanting isn't going to take the form of, or it's not only going to take the form of recreating what looks like a pristine rainforest, which is an interesting philosophical question anyway. What is a pristine rainforest, given that people have been living in these places for 10,000 years? But anyway, if we want to start replanting, we need to find economically viable models to encourage people to do so. Particularly, in poor countries, you can't just tell people put a fence around the forest and don't touch it. People need to make money, they need to live, they need to eat.
And they've always done so in the forest, but obviously with an explosion of, with the change of lifestyle and explosion of populations, the pressure became or becomes too much.
Yeah, there's a long history of cultivating food in the Amazon. And there's a lot of interesting archaeological work. It's kind of working at the overlap between archaeology and botany and anthropology to try and figure out what these Amazonian societies looked like. But it seems quite clear that there were, what we would now consider as orchards or plantations in the middle of forests, that people identified particular species that were useful to them. And rather than having to go out and, forage for them, well, why not plant these species close to where you live? So the native rainforest, for at least 10,000 years, in the case of the Amazon, has had some human influence, and people are mapping where archaeological sites are and then overlaying that with botanical surveys and saying, look, every time there's a human settlement, there's certain species that occur in much higher concentrations than they would do naturally. So it seems fairly clear that there was some kind of commercial fruit plantation and, for medicine or timber that the people in the Amazon have been cultivating certain plants for a long time. What's changed now is that there's huge chunks of the forest that are being cut down, and that's primarily for soy or cattle. A bit of mining as well, but it's mainly soy and cattle that are driving that. And soy in itself is used as feed for livestock. So yeah, it's sort of meat production is probably the biggest thing that's driving deforestation.
And is that something that there's a lot of talk about meat replacement, plant-based food, etc. Is it something you are looking at as well?
Yes, but with I would sort of put a caveat on that. There's certain vegetables and certain fruits that have a very high protein content. So I'm extremely interested in, identifying what those are and trying to create new markets for these. There's 4,000 fruits in the Amazon. We don't know what half of them do. We haven't really carried out the analysis on it. But acai, which is one of the fruits that we'll be planting in Amapá, which has become a kind of trendy fruit in the US and increasingly in Europe. Superfood, yeah. And it's got a ton of vitamins. It's also got protein in there. So there are lots of naturally occurring plants that can be used as sources of vegetable protein. Where I'm a little bit cautious is when you get into the more sort of high-tech approaches. And what makes me uneasy there is that if you get to a point where certain very wealthy people essentially own the IP on food, I'm not convinced that the social consequences of that, which will be negative social consequences, would be enough to justify the positive environmental ones. So that's where I'm a little bit uneasy about some of these meat replacements. In theory, it's good, and we do need to significantly reduce the amounts of livestock that are being produced and consumed. But if we end up replacing an environmental problem with a social problem, i.e., a handful of billionaires own the IP on food, I'm not sure that that's a good thing. In fact, I'm sure it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I know. We would just replace one problem with the other, and probably, it becomes an issue.
I think it is an issue. There's obviously a difference of opinion on this, but that's as much to do with corporate governance and with the way these investments are structured as it is to do with the underlying technology itself. Soya, tofu, or seitan. There are processed vegetable proteins that have existed for a long time. So the fact that somebody is making a meat replacement doesn't bother me at all. What bothers me is who ends up owning that technology. And if there's a serious problem to do with wealth concentration in the world at the moment, and in places like the US, it's getting worse rather than getting better. And if we don't address that problem, there's no hope of addressing climate change either, because the people who are causing the most damage are the wealthy people. They have very consumer-driven lifestyles, but also the very poor people. Because if you're sort of desperately poor, you're going to try and make your living any way you can. If there's a tree, you'll cut it down, burn it for firewood, whatever. So if we exacerbate these problems of income inequality, there is no hope of addressing climate change. And even in and of itself, we shouldn't be driving income inequality. So that's where my slight concern is around some of these processed food technologies. It's who owns the IP. It's not the technology in itself that bothers me.
And what will you be working on? Let's say we talk again in a year from now. What will you be looking back at? And in 2018 was the year of X, Y, and Z. What would you be happy to look back at?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll be happy if more people, take the plunge and start, actually allocating capital. And that seems to be happening already. For my own personal projects, an area that interests me, when you harvest fruit or crops, what do you do with the residues? Some of those residues you can recycle them back into the land. Not the same with timber harvesting. Some of that will go back into the land. Not all of agricultural residues will decompose rapidly enough to be of use in a commercial farming venture. You want stuff to decompose within a year so that you can use it next year. So what do you do with that excess of residue, or what do you do with the stuff that by its sort of structure doesn't decompose very quickly? How do you put those residues to use? And again, it could be industrial or it could be cosmetic, but non-food uses for agricultural residues, and getting that balance right so that you're not taking away productive land that can be used for food production, but you are valorizing as much of what you produce as possible. So I think, that's hopefully where I will be next year. And who knows, maybe one day I'll, my own personal circle will join up and I'll start, getting closer to what it is that my grandfather did, which was, sort of high-tech component parts. And there's interesting stuff going on there, with natural fibers, including for the car industry. Cars are being built using agricultural residues, which is a pretty. It's
an interesting circle for you, yeah.
For me personally, it would be interesting to go full circle and to end up getting a little bit closer to what it was that my grandfather did. I never thought that's where I would end up, but who knows? Life can take you in funny directions.
And looking at the people that didn't take the plunge yet, but that are interested, what do you see as the two most important barriers of making regenerative agriculture and agroforestry on a broader scale economically viable, but also accepted and fit into portfolios, basically?
That's a great question. I think historically it's been an asset class for wealthy investors, both because of the amount of money that you need to get active in this space, and also because of the amount of time you need to tie it up for. That most people don't have large amounts of money that they can tie up for a long period of time. So I think that's been off-putting to individual investors. To institutional investors, I think what's off-putting...
It's probably also the time, yeah.
It's partly the time. Even people who say they're long-term investors wouldn't be prepared. Most of them aren't going to lock up their money for 20 years, and very few will lock it up for 10 years.
Yeah, also because I heard yesterday a lot of the bonus structures and compensation structures are still on a very short-term basis. So if you pay somebody to deliver short-term results, although you have in your company headlines, etc., we are a long-term investor. If you pay your people to have short-term results, they probably will get up with short-term results. And so if the underlying structure, investment structure, but also compensation, basically the whole internal structure doesn't line up with long-term, it's very difficult to get those long-term results we want. Yeah. No, I think that's certainly true. And there's maybe more flexibility from corporate investors. If there's somebody who has an obvious strategic interest in securing their supply chain and making it sustainable for the long term, I think you might see corporates move quicker than pure financial investors. Have you seen it already in this space?
On a small scale, yes, some corporates are doing it, and there's sometimes it's coming more from a sort of quasi-philanthropic angle, so it's a sort of odd mix of sort of R&D meets philanthropy. There are some corporates are looking, more seriously at their whole supply chain. I was chatting just last night with someone from Caring, which is a big French sort of
luxury,
yeah, exactly, a luxury conglomerate, and they do seem to be looking quite seriously at their entire supply chain. Where is our wool coming from? Where is our cotton coming from? Where is our leather coming from?
They did a true price analysis, right? For Puma and then for their whole company. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah,
which was interesting because leather was their main. If the true price of their whole supply chain was in their profit statement, they would be running at a loss, mainly because of their suppliers, mainly because of where they get their raw materials from.
Right. So I think there are some companies who are looking at this in quite a serious way and realizing that it's important to them if they want to secure those supply chains in the future. Sustainability isn't just a buzzword; it's vital. So I think there are some corporates are beginning to do this, and obviously the closer your business is to the raw materials, the more of an issue it is for you, because we live in quite sort of a dematerialized world, and this maybe is a barrier as well to people investing into regenerative agriculture. So much of what we do seems kind of invisible, electricity or the Skype connection that we're using to talk to each other, that we can end up being quite disconnected from the actual raw materials that are necessary to enable our lives. So the closer one can get to those raw materials, whether it's because you're a corporate that uses them, or whether it's just some kind of life experience, you go on a trip to the forest, or you grew up on a farm. I think the closer one can get back to those raw materials, the more likely one is to make the plunge. So that the sort of dematerialized lives that most of us in the developed world live, I think is potentially an impediment to more people putting money into regenerative agriculture as well.
And would that be, and that would be my final question, also your advice to smart impact investors who are the smart impact investors who are hopefully all listening to this podcast and that are ready or they are interested in regenerative agriculture, they have educated themselves. Would it be your advice to go out and also get closer to potential investments, and what would other advice be for people that want to take the plunge like you?
I think it's a hugely important area to be investing into, because no matter how dematerialized our lives feel, we are totally dependent on these raw materials for our food, for our clothing, and even for this Skype call. The computer, the servers that we're using, they're all built out of something. They don't.
The air we breathe, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a hugely important area to be investing into. I guess my advice to people who are interested in this, spend a bit of time figuring out what seems the right way for you to do it. How much money do you have to invest? How long can you afford? How much can you afford to lose? How long can you afford to lock it up for? Think a bit about where in the value chain you want to invest. Do you want to be investing directly into the land itself? Do you want to be investing into processing or distribution? Think about geography. Do you want to invest in your own country or your own neighborhood, or, your own region? Do you want to go into a foreign geography? Think about water. Unfortunately, some parts of the world, it sounds kind of mean to say this, but they won't have enough water, so it's probably not a good place to be investing, even if those places desperately need investment, unless you can think of a way to manage those issues of inadequate water supply. That's a risk to take into account. And then I would say just do it. Put a small amount to work. And there are ways now that exist, with crowdfunding, or in the US you have these.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. What would actually, I always ask a last question and then I ask another last question. But do you see now that there are ways to overcome these two barriers you mentioned, both the time that money has to be locked in, but also that the starter amount, you need quite a bit of money to be in to the place. But actually, you were answering that question right away. So please go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think crowdfunding is a positive development, or peer-to-peer lending. In the US, you now have these REITs, real estate investment trusts, which allow people to put smaller amounts into farmland, because some of them are farmland investing vehicles. So hopefully we'll see more developments like that. Cryptocurrency, is a big buzzword at the moment. I'm not 100% sure that the infrastructure exists yet for allocating money via cryptocurrency, but I'm slightly out of my depth here. So maybe that's something else that might develop in 2018 or 2020. That there will be new ways for people to put smaller amounts, to pool smaller amounts, and put their money to work collectively into regenerative agriculture.
I mean, if we can use Skype and etc. to make these calls, also that should be possible, right?
It ought to be possible. I'm a little bit wary just because I see a lot of froth and fraud going on with
cowboys. Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
There's get rich quick with cryptocurrencies, and as soon as they start saying get rich quick with farmland, you should be very very careful.
Yeah, you should be very careful. You can get rich slowly,
or lose it very fast.
We have this or lose it fast. There are these cultural memes and messages that we hear. So, move fast and break things. This is what the kind of Silicon Valley venture capitalists are saying, and I would almost say what we need is the exact opposite, move slowly and build things. It doesn't mean you can't make money, but it won't be at the same rate. It will be more sort of slow and steady.
That's extremely interesting. Yeah, and in agriculture, forestry is even more long-term. And I mean, time means a very different thing compared if you're building an app, obviously. And I see also these discussions with investors and with fund managers and a lot of people that they have to get used again to not a different way of investing, but a different pace and a different expectations, and things don't move that fast because you have the seasons and nature is inherent slow, but will continue to move for a long time. So there's this and people got a bit disconnected from that in general, probably in life, but also in their investment practices, that they expect something in quarter 2 instead of year 5, and that's quite a long. We have to get slowly used to a slower pace there.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of throw this out. I don't know if this is my last comment or my penultimate comment, but if we're sort of serious about sustainability, to me, there's an elephant in the room, which is the way stock markets perform at the moment, or the way GDP growth has been performing over the last 100 or even 200 years, is totally dependent on burning fossil fuels. So it's not just, ExxonMobil or Total or Shell or BP that are gonna see a destruction of value if we move to a sustainable economy. All across the stock market, you're gonna see a significant correction. I'm not saying we'll go back to sort of pre-industrial levels of growth, because our technology is far better than it was then. But somewhere between the levels of growth we've got used to and those pre-industrial levels of growth, there is going to be at some point there will be a correction. And if we, as impact investors or environmental investors or whatever you want to say, if we're serious about sustainability, how do we anticipate that correction? I don't know when it will come, but how do we anticipate that overall market movement? How do we prepare for it? And again, part of the reasons, or one of the reasons I've ended up investing in the two geographies I have in New Zealand, now in Brazil, is that not all countries are created equal. So if we do start reverting to natural levels of growth, i.e. how much can the planet produce in 1 year, and we consume less than the planet produces in 1 year, you as an investor probably want to be in those parts of the planet that have high levels of natural growth. New Zealand has pretty good growth levels. Brazil has excellent growth levels. And there's a sort of a strip of land around the equator worldwide where things just grow quicker. Those aren't necessarily the easiest countries to be investing into. They tend to be, and poorly governed.
Which is very weird if you think about it.
It's strange, isn't it?
The places where it grows the best ends up being, in many cases, the poorest.
It's a paradox, isn't it? But maybe this is not for 2018, but maybe in 100 years' time, try and imagine a world without fossil fuels, where we're only living on what the planet can produce in 1 year, rather than fossil fuels that took 300 million years to form. Then maybe these countries that historically have been poor and have had a bad deal from globalization will find themselves in a dominant position. That would be a pretty radical shift.
Yeah, because they can produce the food, the fibers, and the oils we need.
It would seem the obvious place to source all of those products from, the places where they grow quickest.
I feel like we can talk another hour on that, but I want to be conscious of your time as well.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure.
And we'll just check in again. I mean, that's there's no reason not to do it, because probably in 2018 Skype will still be there.
Skype will still be there.
And otherwise we find another technology to get this recorded.
Exactly. We'll check in 100 years' time and see if my prediction was right.
I'm imagining it will go a bit faster, but we'll see. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll definitely check in before 100 years.
Okay, it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking. Thank you very much.
You just listened to an interview with Rufo. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and all of the tips he shared on how to start investing in regenerative agriculture and take the plunge. Thank you for making the time to listen to this podcast and making it all the way till the end. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're going to look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soy builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.